From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Clarissa Mall, producer and moderator of The Bulletin. This coming week, Amazon Studios releases the second season of its popular show, The Lord of the Rings of Power, a series based on Tolkien's mythology of the world he created called Middle-earth. Today, Mike Cosper sits down first with directors Patrick McKay and J.D. Payne, and then sits down with actors Charlie Vickers, who plays Sauron, and Daniel Wayman, who plays the Stranger, to talk about power, character, and the timeless appeal of these fantasy stories. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for making time. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Of course. Mike, thanks for having us.
I want to start kind of all the way at the very beginning of this. What drew you to a Tolkien project like this? Or were you all Tolkien fans in the first place? Were you Tolkien nerds? Did you have the little figurines when you were kids? Were you poring over the books?
Yeah, I grew up with the books. I was a voracious reader when I was a kid. I did all of the Chronicles of Narnia, and then I went into The Hobbit and did The Lord of the Rings when I was probably in like 7th or 8th grade. So then when word came out that Peter Jackson was making those films, I was sort of like the guy who already had his ticket bought. And I think that's where JD kind of joins the party in a way.
Yeah. I did not read the books as a kid, but, loved the Jackson films. And, they are some of the rare movies that I watched as a grown-up, really, that came into my canon and into my heart the way that films did from when I was a kid, and still watch them regularly. So when we heard that Amazon had gotten the rights to the material and the opportunity to come and pitch on it came in, it was, could not pass it up. We, along with everyone else in Hollywood, raised their hands for sure. Yes, we have a story we'd love to tell. And then when it actually came to pass that we were going to be able to show on this thing, it was absolutely a dream come true.
JD and I have been working together for 27 years since we were in high school. We, had written some original screenplays that got us some attention. We got to work on all kinds of different worlds that we loved, Star Trek and some work in the X-Men world and some work in the Godzilla world. But essentially when this came along, we went after it whole hog. Yeah. We had the notion that if you were going to do a show in Middle-earth, that there was this one era in the mythology that would be so ripe for exploration. If you remember Peter's film Fellowship of the Ring, the first 5 minutes, Kate Blanchett says, "It began with the forging of the rings. Elves got rings, dwarves got rings, men got rings, but they were all deceived. Sauron had a ring of his own, and he conquered the world, and everybody kind of had to team up to fight him back." And we felt like, what if instead of taking 5 minutes to tell that story, you told it over 50 hours and do the mega epic in the streaming world with all the bells and whistles and all the technological advancements that could make it hopefully as grand and majestic as you could possibly believe.
How does it feel carrying the weight of the franchise, so to speak, right? Like, people have such affection for this. And obviously, you're talking about Star Trek, you're talking about Godzilla, lots of affection for those. But there's something different about Tolkien, right? Like, there's something sort of legendary with Tolkien. Does that weight sharpen the work? Does it make it more intimidating in any way?
It's a huge responsibility. These books touch on the sacred for us. Literally, in my dad's eulogy, I quoted Tolkien. And I firmly believe that one day, after this life, I will look Tolkien in the eye and he'll say, what did you do with your stewardship over Middle-earth? And I'm going to have to make an accounting for it, and that's a big responsibility in terms of the pressure we put on ourselves to come at the work with reverence, but also with boldness. You can't do this halfway and you can't do it by tiptoeing around. You have to make bold decisions as a dramatist. So we approach the work with a lot of love and a lot of respect. But, really, the second age, there's a lot of places where you have to invent. The third age, to the day, Tolkien wrote sort of what was going on Thursday, October 29th. But in the second age, you'll get Celebrimbor forges the rings, Sauron comes to Eregion, and it's a list of dates. Then in some songs and some poems, they give a little more context, but it's like dots of the light in the sky. And you have to not only connect the dots, but fill in the picture around the entire constellation.
We're also, massive fans of some of these great beloved franchises, whether it's in the fantasy world or science fiction or Star Wars or whatever. We mentioned Star Trek. We know how precious those things are, pun not intended, to fans, because we are those fans. And when Star Wars is coming back or there's a new Star Trek show, we're the first people who want it to be spectacular. And that's a responsibility that is daunting, but also, it's a great joy to be able to carry the ring for the period with which we're given the opportunity to do so.
Given all that, I'm curious, did that shape the decisions you were making, particularly thinking about the writing, right? Because you do have to invent. How did that shape some of the choices you made in terms of the writing, the writers you brought in? Did you put a writer's room together for this? Like, what did that process look like?
We built our murderer's row of writers from TV and film and have now worked with them very closely for 2 full seasons to bring each of these worlds and characters to life. And part of casting that is also just finding delightful, lovely, wonderful people you want to collaborate with. But also part of that is having a sense of what True North is. And when it comes to Middle-earth, we knew that it was going to be a story that dealt with good and evil, the complexities of evil and the complexities of good. We wanted a story that was going to have this vast array of tones, where sometimes it almost feels like a horror movie. Other times it's an epic political drama. Other times it's sort of whimsical and sweet and almost silly sometimes. Season 2, we're hopefully moving into new territory where at times it almost feels like a psychological thriller. And part of casting the writer's room is knowing that you want your meal to be the sort of balanced Thanksgiving dinner of all the different tones that Middle-earth can be.
Another aspect of the Tolkien thing that's interesting to me is use Star Trek as a reference point, right? Like, different iterations of Star Trek in many ways are about very different visions. Tolkien is so defined by ideas like providence and certain ideas about virtue, friendship, character. When you're inventing in the ways that you're inventing to fill out this second age, how are you thinking about those things? How are you informing the imagination, I guess, to live into those values that inform all that he does in the later stories, right?
There's a great moment in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade where Sean Connery at the beginning is, working with his Grail diary, and you hear him say from behind, he says, "May he who illuminated this manuscript illuminate me." I think we are constantly trying to do a similar thing with Tolkien and to sort of tap into the source of inspiration that we feel like he did as he was doing. And some of that was historical and literary, some of that spiritual. So we're always asking ourselves, does this feel Tolkienian? Are we inventing in a Tolkienian way? Is this a thing that Tolkien would have done?
Characters in Tolkien can fall from good into darkness. Corruption is a huge theme, but inherent within that is the idea that there is such a thing as good and evil. If it's all relativistic and it doesn't matter and might makes right, then what meaning does any of that have, right? But that doesn't mean that everyone exists in a black and white spectrum, right? There's all kinds of areas in between where a good hero like Boromir might seek to use evil in the ring with hopefully good ends. And the collision of those two and characters trying to navigate that is a source of an enormous amount of drama. Think about, Frodo fighting the corruption of the ring, or Gollum and Smeagol having, in some ways an angel on a shoulder or a devil on a shoulder, depending on which one of them you're talking to. Good and evil are real things in Tolkien. And people who read Tolkien do so because in the end, good wins. But that doesn't mean that the struggle is easy. This is the stuff that, the fertile ground that we think about every single day and with every single character and every single story.
And there's fates in Tolkien worse than death. Theoden dies, but it's a good death. He's died fighting an impossible enemy, leading his people to victory. Fates worse than death are corruption, when people's virtue is given over to the ring and the ring overpowers them. Dramatically, that puts us in a really interesting place. Often, the stake is life or death. This is a stake that's slightly different than that. I mean, death is still an important stake, but it's not the only stake in Tolkien.
Well, and I think one of the things you guys have captured so well in the series, both in season 1 and the handful of episodes I've seen of season 2 already, is the seductive nature of evil and the seduction of power. Like, that's such an important part of Tolkien's vision, where so often the way we talk about evil in our storytelling now, it's always pathologized. It's right. Somebody breaks bad because they've suffered or something terrible's happened to them or whatever. It sort of forces them into this place where they have no choice but to become the Joker or whatever. Where it's like in Tolkien's world, there's something about power that's incredibly seductive, where for the sake of those ends, I'm willing to begin to compromise other virtues, other ideas to get there. It's a concept we don't hear a lot in contemporary storytelling. It's one of the things that makes Tolkien feel a little almost like a man of a different age. I wonder if you've thought about that, if that informed the writing as well.
Very, very much so. I mean, there's a sort of New Testament concept that weak things can be made strong.
Right.
In Tolkien, what's terrifying is that through Sauron, strong things can be made weak. Sauron sees your virtues. He sees your desire to do good. Celebrimbor wants to create objects of beauty that are going to be healing and redemptive for Middle-earth. Sauron sees that desire, which is a good desire in Celebrimbor, and is able to twist it to his own evil ends.
Think about the ultimate good in terms of the Lord of the Rings novel is probably Gandalf, right? He's true north. But even Gandalf says, don't tempt me with the ring. right? Galadriel says, whoa, I've always wanted that power. The idea that not just good, but like the ultimate good in Tolkien's world is susceptible to corruption. I mean, that's a huge and radically complex idea. Sometimes people talk about Lord of the Rings or Middle Earth as if it's all black and white. That's actually really not true. But again, that's like a different thing than saying there isn't good and evil.
Tolkien writes his books at the end of the Second World War. They're informed in many ways by the shape of the world at that time. We live in strange times in history, right? Like
whatever do you mean?
Exactly. Yeah, I think Hannah Arendt was the one who said, it's a curse to live in interesting times, is what she said. And so there's all kinds of there's crazy stuff happening in the US, there's stuff happening in Europe, and all of this. Do you think there's a particular relevance to Tolkien in our moment, given the rise of nationalism, the rise of the allure of power in ways that we haven't seen in a while, I suppose?
So I dare say one of the reasons that, this world and this material has spoken to people across decades and, now almost coming up on, an entire century since he wrote The Hobbit, is that it's actually timeless and it can speak to the historical moment, no matter when the historical moment is. Tolkien talked about his, desire to create something that was not allegorical, which is speaking to a specific time, but applicable to all times. And when we're looking at every season of this show, what we're trying to do is hopefully create something that speaks to all moments. In success, that will also speak to the present moment, but we're never sort of like playing a gotcha game of like trying to riff on whatever the CNN horror show of the day is. Even though, just as viewers, we watch season 2 and we feel things that speak to the present moment, but certainly not consciously trying to comment on anything like that.
But yeah, in some ways, trying very hard not to. We try to make it so that really kind of anyone can look in some of these groups and say, I see some of myself reflected there. And some of myself is also reflected there. And that's a little uncomfortable. And what does that mean about the forces of tribalism in our own time and how we respond to some of the same kind of forces that are driving some of the story in various parts of Middle Earth?
At least that's the aspiration.
Yeah, for sure. What do you feel most excited about for viewers to see with the coming season?
Thank you for asking that. Season 1, we wanted to bring, audiences back to Middle Earth in hopefully the grandest, most majestic way imaginable. And that's Middle Earth at a time of peace. And we're meeting all our different worlds. We're meeting Numenor. We're meeting the world of the Harfoots. We're meeting the world of the Southlands. We're meeting the world of the Elves. And hopefully there's a grand and delightful adventure that they're all going to go on. But it's an adventure that ultimately has a destination, and that destination is named Sauron. He's hiding amongst them. Galadriel believes there's evil out there. She's too proud to slow down when people tell her not to look too hard. Come to find out, he was standing right next to her all along. So, as we go into season 2 now, the chessboard has been set and now the game is afoot. One of the things we like about a large ensemble cast like this is the idea that from season to season, different figures will rise into the spotlight and then maybe have a slightly smaller role, but then maybe come back even bigger after that. Charlie Edwards, we had to kind of dangle a carrot to pull him into the merry band by saying, look, Celebrimbor, the Elvin da Vinci is a smaller role, season 1. He plays a supporting role, an important role, but a supporting one. But join us on this adventure. And season 2, we got a great story for you. Because season 2 now really becomes Sauron is here. And the way he's going to conquer the world is to deceive Celebrimbor into making the Rings of Power. And that creates the psychological thriller I mentioned a little earlier, which is the core of the second season is actually that relationship where Sauron essentially seduces and deceives Celebrimbor into creating evil. The thing we like about Sauron as a villain, first of all, he's quite subtle. He comes to you with a smile. He comes to you in the form that will be most likely to allow him to manipulate you. And he turns your greatest strength to his own ends. And watching that play out between those two characters and those two amazing actors, Charlie Vickers and Charlie Edwards, is a very different kind of story than anything we did season 1, and one we're really excited to share with people.
How's it going?
It's good.
Good, man.
Terrific. Well, first of all, I've gotten to watch the first few episodes here. It's terrific. I'm really thankful for the chance to talk to you all. And let me back up a little bit and just ask, before you came to the project, were either of you big Tolkien fans to begin with?
I'd been sort of versed in Tolkien for 20 odd years, I suppose, but never as far as the Silmarillion, just the sort of Lord of the Rings books. And so for me, it was fun to start diving back. I really enjoyed diving into Silmarillion to give some sort of beginning to the overall journey. That was a really fun thing.
Yeah, I would say I was a casual fan of Tolkien. Like, I had watched all the movies, quite a few times. I was a big fan. Like, our friends would talk about the Lord of the Rings, I guess, but it was always based in the Peter Jackson trilogy. Although I played the video games quite a few times.
Nice.
Back when like the actual actors would voice their video game characters. That was very cool. But it was a whole new world when I was cast, and then opened my eyes to the Silmarillion. And I had to learn quite early on to try to let go of other people's expectations, because I can't control other people's expectations. I can only control, what I expected myself in terms of the work. But it's funny because we sit and it's very serious. We talk about these things very seriously. And then sometimes I check myself and I'm like, oh, hang on, we're dressing up and like doing really cool things. But it does matter so much to so many people, including all of us. It's such a huge part of our lives now. It's an immense privilege to kind of be the torchbearers for this part of Indian history and adaptation.
The amount of space that it takes up in my own being to give my version of this stranger is so all-consuming, whether that's physically, vocally, in terms of the makeup and the hair and what the costume does, where the scenes are going, where the story's going, and the overarching journeys of the seasons. That's such a large amount of complexity that actually it hasn't left much room for me in either season of getting too bound up in what other people might need it to be. And I'd say, actually, because the people who have been helming the show and all the different departments have such artistry and such skill and want to pour themselves into their work so fully, that's meant that the pressure has been reduced. Like, I can see how much it means to everybody. I can see how, when I work with, I'm working with Markella and Megan, I see how much care and attention they give it. I know what I'm giving it. That is ultimately, with any piece of art, that's the most you can do.
Yeah.
And you then put it out there, and what the audience make of it is absolutely up to them.
Yeah, it's not your responsibility what people think of it.
Yeah. But it feels good to know that what we're putting in is, I think what people would want us to put in is what's being put in.
Yeah, exactly. Well said.
Yeah.
That brings me to another question for you, Daniel, actually, because your character, the stranger, we don't quite know exactly who he is. There's obviously lots of fan theories, and there's some hinting that he may be a familiar wizard, he may be a different wizard, he may be... But I was just thinking about you stepping into this role, regardless of where the character goes and what else we learn about him. The two wizards we know best, particularly from the films, the wizards we know best were performed by Ian McKellen. Sorry, in this world. Ian McKellen and Christopher Lee, these like titans, right, of actors. Was there anything intimidating about that in particular? Did you see that as like, oh my gosh? Or was that like, ooh, opportunity, like put me in, coach?
When it all started, the very first audition I had, it was utterly unclear that the scene that I had to read for was a wizard. So I didn't know. The character names they were all pseudonyms, so I didn't know what the names were of characters that I was either reading with or reading against. Then when I got a recall and did it again, it was still unclear that it wasn't spelled out that it was wizard. Then when I got talking to the showrunners, they started talking really largely about the idea that the guy had no language. They talked about arriving in this sort of fireball, but they were keen to keep alive the play of good and bad. And so they wanted me to come up with an audition piece effectively that would showcase physical storytelling that could be both scary to an audience and bring them in and say, oh, we really like that character. So by the time I did that, I was a certain way down the path. But then even when I got out to New Zealand and started rehearsing with Markella and Megan, then nobody was saying what the journey was. It was only sort of midway through the first season that they started saying, okay, so he's clearly not human. He's not elf or dwarf. He's something else, but we're playing this thing about darkness. He clearly enjoys, is seduced by, like with the fireflies is a great example. He talks to these fireflies and that seems to be one thing. And then he kills the fireflies and there's something in him that I always read, which was, oh, this is pretty cool. This is pretty cool to be able to take life away.
Yeah.
And you know more about this, but that seduction has been kept live all the way through the season. And so it wasn't like there was ever a point when I got those two wizards and went, there's pressure here, because I was only really ever playing this character at the beginning of a journey.
I know exactly what you mean. It's its own thing.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and a similar question for you, Charlie, because you're playing Sauron, and here's this character who he's almost more of an icon. Like, you don't get much personality from him, from the original book, from the original films even necessarily.
Yeah.
You have to bring this guy to life. In a sense, you're humanized, but he's sort of the embodiment of evil at the same time. How did you think about that? How did you think about portraying that kind of a character?
It's tricky to humanize him because often I was talking about it with Morveth before and touching on his relationship with Galadriel in the first season. And it's like some people interpreted it as romantic, and I completely see from a viewer's perspective how that would happen. But then I was like, we could never think of it like that because Sauron is a god, he's a demigod. He probably doesn't feel any kind of romantic feelings or lust or whatever, these kind of human feelings that we feel. It's greater than that. It's like a cosmic connection is the way that was kind of what he felt with her. So I guess I kind of start looking at the character from the lens of what is he trying to do? And particularly in the first season, Halbrand was the guise through which he deceived Galadriel. He kind of presents himself as this thing that the other person needs. And in the same way he does it in the second season with Celebrimbor. Sauron presents himself and everything, the way that we decided he would look, the way he walked, the way he talked, was all for Celebrimbor. It's like the greatest elven smith in the world. What would the person that commands his respect look like?
Right. Yeah.
How would he talk? How would he walk? It has to come from there because otherwise Tolkien said nothing about Sauron's fair form. He just said he had a fair form. There's a couple of descriptions, but they're kind of contradictory. One, he's like 10 foot tall or something like that. It's like, he didn't even say he was an elf. We chose that because I think the firstborn is how Sauron would have presented himself. But I find often that the weight of the character and the weight of expectation kind of dissipates if you just think about the facts and work from a place of like a through line of intention, really.
Power is so central. It's in the title. It's so central to these stories. What do you think of the relevance of that theme in our moment?
I think it's incredibly relevant. And I think that's what makes a lot of Tolkien stuff translate over decades. In Sauron's case, it's like a lust for power, but it's a lust for control. He genuinely believes that everything will be great if people just shut up and did what I wanted, And then you'll have a nice life. It's just I have to be in control.
It's the classic.
Yeah, exactly. And, we see countless examples of that today in modern life.
And we feel it in ourselves, right?
Yeah.
I definitely identify with that. If only this system would just do what I think it should do, then everything would be fine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Do you notice in yourself day to day any of the Sauronisms? Well, yeah, because they're the trappings of life that seduce us anyway. Part of the reason Tolkien's writing about the way power seduces is because that's what it does to us all, right?
Yeah.
I haven't done a job like this in terms of its notoriety or profile in 20 years' work. And I know that I can feel bits of it turning my head and going, oh, this is nice. I got a lovely fruit platter.
Get this in the theatre.
I mean, you definitely don't get this around my house. This is all new stuff to me. But, I could get used to some of it. But I'm intrigued playing Sauron.
Yeah.
How that...
I don't know how it manifests. I think, if anything, I share a lot of similarities with him on a very small scale. It's kind of things like I need everything to be very ordered and neat and structured. In the same way, his is just kind of with civilizations rather than my desk. It's interesting that you talk about the Breaking Bad thing because I do think there's this tendency in modern adaptations, particularly of big IPs, that you get these villains that have to be three-dimensional. And sometimes, for better or worse, I think sometimes characters like Richard III, I think sometimes they're just evil. And Sauron is not one of those, basically. He is three-dimensional in that Tolkien wrote that he wanted to heal and reorder and rehabilitate. And if you approach from that, it just gives it another side to him, rather than he is the embodiment of evil, which he also is.
I remember watching your journey and at many, many points feeling sorry for your character, like I wanted to befriend your character. Like maybe everything wasn't so bad. There's a moment with Galadriel where I was like, I think this is a turning point. I think the world could go a different way. If she says the right answer here, we could be in a different territory. And that's presumably one of the really insidious, and I don't know whether you believe that or whether he's just using as another technique.
I like the ambiguity of it. I think I had to believe it fully as an actor. To fully embody it and try and make it as convincing as possible.
Well, I think it's one of the things that Tolkien does get at is that, particularly in the shadow of the Second World War, the evil that was present in the Second World War and much of the evil of the 20th century, the roots of it were also utopian. They thought they were going to make the world right. They were going to bring an incredible order and all of this. But it was, what were they willing to do as means to the end? The destruction, and Sauron obviously embodies that in a profound way. Was that creepy at all? Like, to just live in that? Do you go home at night and feel like, man, I can't take enough of a long enough shower to get this guy out of my head? Or
I couldn't live in that space as an actor because we do it for too long. Maybe if I was doing it for 2 months, and it was a film and I was on location, but I was going home to my family every night. And it's like, I can't take that home with me because I wouldn't be able to live as a normal person.
Do you have techniques because this is one thing I don't think, from my humble teaching of when I learned about acting, I don't remember techniques for coming out of character. There's a lot about how to get into character.
Yeah.
Have you found ways of coming out of it?
I think kind of particularly with a show like this, and I don't know if you found the same, when you take everything off, I found that kind of like a reset almost, because it's like there is such a process to get ready to go on set and then to leave set. It gives you a lot of time to sort of transition in and out. Did you find that?
Well, I definitely found it getting into character. I think that process, because this season I didn't have my own beard, that came on. But season 1, going home, looking in the mirror and seeing the same bearded guy with the hair, looking slightly crazed all the time, more and more crazed the more it went on, That was something that probably kept me closer in that. Yeah, you're right.
It's a transformative thing.
Yeah. And the time, there is something about the time as well, isn't there? Because that happens in the morning when you're becoming it.
Exactly.
I find that's really helpful. I feel really privileged and grateful to be able to have that time where makeup artists are physically altering your look. I suppose we're also lucky that we don't have the 5.5 hours or 7 hours of the audio. Yeah. Maybe we will be saying that.
Daniel, tell me, for viewers that maybe are just catching up or are looking forward to the new season, what are you most excited for people to see in the episodes to come?
Yeah, so I think there are 2 big strands for me. The first is that I felt, both as an actor and as a sort of viewer, that when we left The Stranger in season 1, the difficulties that he's undergone through that season have sort of been, it seems to me, lifted. The weight has been lifted. He's heading off on this adventure with Nori, somebody he trusts more implicitly than any other being he's met. They're heading off through the grasses and the greenery to a jolly good adventure. It all sounds really hopeful. He's a little lighter of heart. He's going off to find these stars that he thinks are going to tell him something. And very quickly in season 2, the landscape turns from grasses into desert, and the track is dirtier, and the mud turns into sand, and before we know it, we're in horrendously hot baking, no drink, no food, life in danger moments. And he's having horrible dreams, nightmares about things that he hadn't connected before in a negative way. His origin being in this crater, this moment with the staff in episode 8 when something wonderful happens with the mystics, where Nori gives him this staff and he's at his lowest ebb, and she says, you've got to do this yourself. I've got to go over there and save my family. But listen, I believe in you. Get up and do what you need to do. He touches that, and sort of the swell of his heart and the positivity that comes from that is the thing that I think causes the mystics to dissipate. He channels the positivity, helps to be a conduit through this staff. Anyway, so when he starts to have these dreams, the staff, which seemed in his mind to be a wonderful thing, has turned into this possible dangerous thing. He's getting flashes of all sorts of negativity. He's wondering what the purpose is of the stars. And so I think he's plunged from being a place where he thought this adventure was going to lead to a positive outcome. He's being plunged into a more wider understanding of the consequence of Middle-earth being under this ever-growing darkness, which I think he feels through the earth, energetically through the earth. He knows something amiss is happening, but it's now beginning to infect other communities, other landscapes, other beings. And quite what his role in that, he just doesn't know. So that's one thrust. And then the over thrust of that is that rise of evil that we've been talking about, getting more into this idea of what Sauron is doing. I think he's beginning to get a form of, I don't think in season 1 he understood who Sauron was quite, but I think that's coming back. And now this idea that this force is growing, but there may be even two evil forces, this idea of two evil beings throughout the season is really traumatic. You've got one sort of insidious sort of whispering in the ear, Sauron's ability to pull the worst out of anybody he wants to. He can tease out the worst. And I think we as human beings on the Uber scale of what season 2 goes, we can identify with that. You know, it's like that idea of putting the actual ring on. Like, I know I shouldn't do it, but I just gotta see what it feels like to go invisible and be part of, you know, that kind of thing, which is so seductive. And all the different methods that he's going to employ, you know, to do that. So those are the two things for me about season 2.
Yeah.
Charlie, last question for you. For somebody who loves the books or loved the movies and they're going, I don't know, should I dive in? How would you invite someone to take the leap on the show and to check it out if they haven't already?
The Sauron answer should be,
what?
Right.
Watch me. Feast your eyes.
Feast your eyes. I would say for your moviegoer, there is the prologue of The Fellowship of the Ring when Cate Blanchett very eloquently does the voiceover about the creation of the rings right at the beginning. If they want to see that, then they're in the right place this season. As a book reader and someone that, you know, has read parts of the Silmarillion, this is the first time we're getting to the real meaty bits of what is in the book. This show is going to tick off in terms of iconic moments in Tolkien lore. We're ticking the first box this season, you know, which really excites me as a fan. And if you don't know anything about Tolkien, it's still going to be really interesting because there's lots of battles and psychological drama.
Thanks to both of y'all so much for your time. This was great. Loved the show. My daughter's favorite show. Good luck with the season.
Who does she prefer?
Sauron.
Stranger?
Definitely, she's a Sauron fan.
I think she's a Sauron fan. I'm sorry.
Fair enough.
All right. Take care, y'all.
See you later.
Bye.
The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced and moderated by Clarissa Mall. The associate producer is Leslie Thompson. This episode was mixed by Kevin Morris, theme music by Dan Phelps. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, follow the show and tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening.